All right, here we go. I'm reading to you from a book called Team of Rivals, written by one of the great historians in American history, give or take one or two cases of plagiarism, Doris Kearns Goodwin, or Godwin. Team of Rivals, page 204. Presidential debates in 1860. The Republican candidate and Democrat candidate debated 7 times famously around the state of Illinois. The Democrat was Stephen Douglas, and Douglas understood from the outset that his primary goal, more important than debating or defining his own position, was to cast his opponent as a radical bent on abolishing all distinctions between the races. 1860, that was time of slavery in the South. That's what the Civil War soon broke out over. Douglas was certain that no candidate who professed a belief in the social or political equality of blacks and whites could possibly carry Illinois, where a long-standing set of black laws prevented blacks from voting, holding political office, giving testimony in court against whites, and sitting on juries. At every forum, therefore, Douglas missed no opportunity to portray his opponent as a Negro-loving agitator bent on debasing white society. Quote, "If you desire Negro citizenship," unquote, Douglas baited his audience, quote, "if you desire them to vote on an equality with yourselves and to make them eligible to office and to serve on juries and to adjudge your rights, then support my opponent and the Black Republican Party." Oh, the crowd responded as Douglas hoped, "Never, never." Cheers nearly drowned out his voice as he shouted his opinion that, quote, "the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to Negroes at all when they declared all men to be created equal. They did not mean Negro, nor the savage Indians, nor the Fiji Islanders, nor any other barbarous race. They were speaking of white men. I hold that this government was established for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever and should be administered by white men and none others." Cries of "that's the truth" erupted from the agitated throng amid raucous applause during the debate. In response, Abraham Lincoln avowed that he had, quote, "no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races," unquote. He had never been in favor, quote, "of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry," unquote. He acknowledged a physical difference between the two that would probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. Page 204, from Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals. What is my point, and why am I starting with this today? People have to be judged and should be judged based on 2 components that are a little bit contradictory. They should be judged in the abstract. Were they or were they not evil? Is there any justification ever in any time for what they did or said or believed? And on a second level, against the context of their times, can they be excused or understood based on the context of their times? Now, in America, most Americans, probably all, just about all, but not all, not only have excused Lincoln for his racism, they don't even know about it. I mean, what I just read, they don't know about it. They just assume Lincoln wanted to free the slaves, and he was a good guy on civil rights. If Lincoln of 1860 had a platform today running for president, he wouldn't run for president. He wouldn't get anywhere. Yet he's regarded. There's that big monument in Washington, D.C., and he's regarded as the person who took down slavery and, everybody's going to be equal. How do we understand this? People in their times are a reflection of their times. I suspect 100 years from now, people will look back on our times and will find many of the things that were done and said in our times incomprehensible. How could people do that or say that? If it turns out that all the climate change people are right, and the earth is basically coming to an end in 100 years, people will look back 100 years and say, how could people have denied it 100 years ago when they had a chance to save the earth? And on the other hand, if 100 years from now, people still are drinking water and going to the beach and having comfortable times, they're going to look back and say, how is it possible 100 years from now, somebody said that the earth would come to an end in 10 years? And that's how it goes. People look back in the context of time. What did they know? Were they being demagogues? Were they sincerely responding to what they understood? Were they ignorant? A little bit of everything, and so on and so forth. Just as we look back 100 years, 50 years, how could people have believed X, Y, Z? How could people have believed that the earth is flat? How could people have believed this? How could people have believed that? How could people truly have believed that the gods of the Roman and Greek mythology were real and offered sacrifices to Zeus? How could they believe that? I begin tonight's class with that to further put in context what I was teaching in this class Thursday night last week, to understand when we discussed the Rambam last week and the Torah and the halakha of dealing with the 7 nations that occupied Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and the Amalekites, as we also have been talking about Tuesday night class. We were just talking the other night about David bringing his capital and monarchy to Jerusalem, where the Yevusim, the Jebusites, were still living. And we have more to say about that next Tuesday, God willing. That as we learn the law, we also understand it against the context of its times. And sometimes a radical can go just so radical and may even believe more than that. There may be certain things I believe about things that going on in Israel. And it may be that in certain ways I mute some of my feelings, which I believe are absolutely legitimate, because I know they're so, that Jack Nicholson line in A Few Good Men, that people cannot handle the truth. And they need time to be able to handle the truth. 1993, the Israeli public majority endorsed signing an agreement in Oslo, Norway, to let Yasser Arafat be sovereign in Judea, Samaria, part of it, what they call the Palestine Authority. And that won a majority of the Israeli Knesset. Actually, it was a little bit tricky. We don't have time for it now, but the way they got the majority is Yitzhak Rabin paid off a few people in the opposition. He made them cabinet ministers and gave them lifetime pensions and vehicle limousine drivers and all kinds of special lifetime promises, which they got if they would just change their beliefs and vote one time for this one thing. So it wasn't even a majority then, but it was close. And so the Israelis then, I was looking today at a poll, a survey in Israel, more than 80% of Israelis today are opposed to giving the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, a sovereign state, a Palestine state, a 2-state solution. They regard it as a 2-state delusion. And no matter what Norway, Ireland, and Spain say, in Israel today, 80% of the population, it's been surveyed by a major survey company, they're against it. Likewise, in the year 2005, Ariel Sharon was able to cobble together a Knesset majority to evacuate Gaza. Israel had all of Gaza, had all the control, military control, and he convinced the Knesset, the majority, let's get out of there and let the Arabs have a sovereignty in Gaza. Let's just get everybody out of there, end what they call the occupation or the administration of it. Let them just have it, make a country, they'll leave us alone. And that was able to garner a majority vote in the Knesset. And you look back now and you say, how in the world, what were they thinking? And indeed, now the majority of it, the rest of the world may not like what Netanyahu and the Israeli army is doing and the IDF is doing in Gaza, but crazy majorities of like 80% of the Israeli people support it. And that includes a lot of left-wingers, a lot of the kind of liberals and left-wingers who in other countries would be in the forefront of opposing Israel's efforts in Gaza. But Israelis who have faced for 20 years the rocket and missile fire realized they were wrong. And when they look back, they can't figure out what was I thinking. So in every generation, we need to understand times affect the way people think, in many ways for the better. The way most Americans think today, let's say on the subject that I began the class, no matter what the media tries to make a maelstrom of things and to make people hate other people, I mean, just about everybody. There are extremists on the white nationalist supremacists, but 95, 98% of this country, it's just taken as a given that all human beings are equal. No one talks about blacks and whites marrying anymore. No one even thinks about it. No, it's not even, not only is it not an issue, no one even notices it. You go to an event, you see a black and white person together, you see commercials on TV, you don't think about it. Blacks voting, the issue is, are certain people trying to create certain voting districts that would violate one or another right? But the premise of blacks voting, the premise of sitting on a jury, I don't even know, frankly, I don't even know what the racial composition was of today's jury. I could look it up. I'm sure someone wrote about it at some point, but who cares? It was a New York jury. That's all I had to know. Who cares about the racial composition? Or a black person running for office? You've got Democrats. You've got Tim Scott as a Republican. You've got other Republicans. You have from India family, Nikki Haley on one side, Kamala Harris on the other side. No one asks about this stuff anymore. But in its time, Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, kind of said, take for granted certain things aren't appropriate. And it's shocking now that we know it. Maybe he did not believe, maybe he believed all of that was wrong, but he felt it was just not the right time that was all he had to do just to undo slavery. Maybe he was hoping little by little, or maybe he wasn't. We know that at one point he recommended maybe all American black people should go back to Africa. That's what he said. And he really believed it. It'd solve all the problems. So when we talk about the Torah, ordering, for example, commanding that the 7 nations be wiped out, or that Amalek be wiped out, and we say to ourselves, that just doesn't jive with the sensibilities and sensitivities we have in the year 2024, 5784 plate say. We need to remember that the kinds of nations that existed in those days and the way war was fought in those days was different. It's a different time. It's 3,000 years ago. In those days, the winning side aimed to exterminate and eradicate the losing side and to wipe them off the face of the earth. Either you wiped them off the face of the earth or they wiped you off the face of the earth. And if you won a war and stopped short of wiping them off the face of the earth, they would come back when they got stronger and they would try again. And sometimes they would succeed, unless you finally did it first. We find out with Amalek. Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, chapter 15 of Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel, had been commanded to kill out Amalek, and then he spared the life of the king, King Agag. What ended up happening? Amalek was substantially set back and destroyed, but he spared a little bit. And before you know it, Amalek reconstituted, and next thing you know, Haman, the wicked villain of the book of Esther, Purim time, is referred to as Haman Ha'agagi. Haman the Agagite, the descendant of that king who was allowed to remain alive, who impregnated a woman in prison, and thereby one of the guards, and thereby was able to continue his line. And until the Amalekites basically disappeared, however that got to be, to the degree that no one knows who's an Amalekite now, they never stopped trying to kill out and destroy all Jews. It was part of their DNA. And that's what it's like. And by the way, That goes on even today in certain countries. There are certain countries, Turkey, they hate Armenians and they hate Kurds. It's like, I know Armenians. I taught law school, 16 years at Loyola Law School, has a large contingent of students who descend from Armenian families. They're lovely people. In fact, there were some of my favorite students and several of them, my former wife before she passed away, Ellen Zichrona Livracha, and I would invite some of those students to our home for Shabbat meals. I loved that they have also a deep religious orientation, go to church, believe in God, believe in the Bible, have strong moral values about being married and about all the moral values that Orthodox Jews have. And I just love them. But the Turks want to kill them all out, and almost did in 1915, I think it was. Gets marked every year, I think, April 24th, how the Turks actually perpetrated a true genocide. That's the other big genocide. And so there are certain peoples who want to destroy and wipe other peoples off the face of the earth. It's crazy stuff. Erdogan also from Turkey wants to wipe the Kurds off the face of the earth. It's crazy. It's something most of us can't relate to, but that exists. And the only way to stop it is, unfortunately, to defeat the other side so incredibly that you either wipe them out or you bring them to the point that they cry uncle. And so there's a lesson in that also in terms of modern times and what's going on in Israel. But there's also, for the purposes of what we're learning in Rambam, and we're going to go back to Rambam now. Thank you. I wanted very much to begin with that because it's just a necessary part of understanding that when you're judging people or learning about how people were and thought in other times, everybody's got to be understood against their times and their context. It doesn't mean that they are right or that we can justify them. Again, I mean, for us as Jews, it raises a very interesting question about the famous question in literature class, whether Shakespeare was anti-Semitic. Anybody who's ever read Merchant of Venice, it's very anti-Semitic. And there were just fascinating scholarly essays saying that Shakespeare wasn't anti-Semitic. He was philo-Semitic, he was pro-Jewish, but he couldn't sell his play. You wouldn't be able to get an audience in 1600s or whatever England if he was pro-Jewish. So he created Merchant of Venice, and he slipped in to the anti-Semitic audience the famous soliloquy, "Hath not a Jew eyes?" so that they would all have a moment's pause to hear a passionate Shylock soliloquy that Jews are like everyone else. We breathe like other people. We feel pain. We bleed. We laugh. We cry. And there are those who say that Shakespeare actually did that because he was trying to smuggle in some sympathy for Jews in an anti-Semitic world. And others say, look how the story worked. The guy was a Jew hater. So everything is in its context. And it is what it is. And we can only hope that we always move society forward. I was about to say progressively, but that they've made a bad name out of that word. But that's what we got. That's what we have to work for. That people should be able to keep progressing. And often we do, and then suddenly we fall backwards. Like here we were, 1930s Europe, 1940s, 30s Germany was a center of science. After centuries of persecution, under the Weimar Republic, they went democratic, and after a few years, they were back where they started from. It is what it is. We're at Mishneh Torah, Hilkhot Melachim u'Milchamot, the laws of kings and wars, chapter 6, halakha base. V'yesh lamelech lahatnot imahem sheikach hatzim amonam o harkarkaot v'yaniach kol hametatlin o metatlin v'yaniach harkarkaot kavi ma sheyidneh. In a war, and these wars are always taking place in the land of Israel, because the Torah is talking when the Jews going to be making war, When will Jewish ethics and values of war come into play? Only in the land of Israel. Jews do not make war in Ukraine. Jews do not make war in Germany or Spain or Africa or Guatemala. The only place Jews would make war is to defend their place in Israel or to go into the promised land. And that's it. There's no Jewish desire for expansion. That's part of the fallacy among the many fallacies and lies that are being heaved against Israel now, hurled, to claim that Israel is like an expansionist, imperialist, colonialist. That's England. England went into India, Ireland, South Africa, all over the world. Sun never set on the British Empire. France went into Algeria and Morocco, and Spain and Portugal came to the New World in South America. Holland and the Netherlands came to North America. Everybody tried to expand beyond themselves. The Jews never did that. Even at the strongest times of King Solomon, they never went beyond Israel. So we're talking about in Israel and its immediate borders, if there is war against the nations, the designated nations, or a nation that comes to attack, in which case it again becomes a milchemet mitzvah, a commanded war to fight back. Upon winning the war, the people who have given up and lost are given the opportunity to make peace. In the first instance, the plan is not to kill them out, just to beat them, defeat them, get them to surrender, and then they are given a choice. The king, because all these laws presume a time of a monarch, democracy and everything is post-biblical, post-Talmudic, and post-Rambam. Democracy, yeah, sure, there were the Greeks, but that wasn't the kind of democracy we think of nowadays when we think of the post-1700s Europe since the French Revolution and American Revolution, where a king was the autocrat and monarch, as we've been learning on Thursday night class for many weeks. He would have the authority to basically tell the conquered people, either I get your money, you will have to pay a monetary tax, or you will have to give up your land, half their financial resources, or he may propose to take all their landed property and leave them with their movable property. Landed property is like if you owned a house or you own a field. Movable property in modern times would be your couch and your beds and your television, your appliances. Or he could take the movable property and let them keep their land and their non-movable property. And so they're left with half their money, they're left with some of their property, and because they made war against Israel, they also lose. And that's a very important concept that people forget. If the Arabs had not made war against Israel, they would not have lost land to Israel. In 1948, the United Nations wanted to impose a two-state, three-state delusion solution. They took the Palestine mandate that the League of Nations gave Britain in 1917, and they tore all of it east of the Jordan River, 78% of the Palestine mandate, and they gave that to create a brand new country that never existed before, Jordan. In fact, initially, they didn't know what to call it. You could look this up. So they called it Transjordan. In other words, to cross the Jordan. What's its name? I don't know. Here's the Jordan River. They get everything Transjordan. We'll call it Transjordan. And then later, the Arabs shortened the name to Jordan. That was one Arab state. That was the two-state solution. So now the Arabs were given 78% of Palestine, and the Jews were left with 22%. And then they came up with another two-state solution, that the Arabs will get a big primary chunk of west of the Jordan River, and the Jews will be left with a little sliver, a little sardine of a country that consists of Haifa, Tel Aviv, and like the Negev, where nothing can grow, because until the Jews became sovereign there, nothing had grown there for 2,000 years. It was a desert. So they gave them Tel Aviv, they gave them Haifa, and they gave them a big desert. That was the country. What about Jerusalem? Jerusalem was internationalized initially. Jews didn't get any of it. What about the airport, Lod Airport? Internationalized. What about Haifa Harbor? Internationalized. The Jews were given by the UN in 1947 a country that had no harbor, no airport, no Jerusalem. Count Volker Bernadotte was sent by the United Nations to Palestine to finalize and seal the deal. He was going to come back with a final recommendation to split up the remaining 22%. The Jews get Haifa, Tel Aviv, and the desert. No Jerusalem, no airport, no harbor. He never came back. The Lehi assassinated him. The head of the Lehi who gave the order was Yitzhak Shamir, of blessed memory, and he eventually became Prime Minister of Israel. And so they had to go back to the drawing board, and nobody from the UN was in a mode right away to go to Israel or Palestine. So they didn't have Zoom, so they just did it from the UN in New York. And they came up with a split, and they gave the Arabs majority of the half, and they gave the Jews a little bit of what was left. And if the Arabs simply had taken it, they would have basically gotten they would have had their Palestine state, and they would have had their other Palestine state, and the Jews would have had Haifa, Tel Aviv, and a dry desert. The Arabs went to war. They wouldn't even give the Jews that. You go to war, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The Arabs lost. So Israel was able to get, the Jews did not take all of Judea Samaria, but they were able to get Western Jerusalem. And they were able to liberate the land that became Ben Gurion Airport. And they were able to liberate Haifa Harbor, so Jews could get in there. The way British had denied Jews the right to come into Haifa Harbor, when they fled Hitler to try to find a place in the world to go because no other country would take them. And the British sent them back because they wouldn't let them in. Now Israel had a harbor. Jews anywhere in the world could arrive by plane or could arrive by sea. 1967, Nasser in Egypt and Syria decided to make another war. Too many years, 19 years of Jews, enough Jews. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Let's drive the Jews to the sea. They made war. Israel had to defend itself in 1967. By miracle of God, truly by miracle of God. What does it say in the Torah? It says in the Torah, Vayiksha Hashem et leiv Paro, that God continually hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Pharaoh should have just let the Jews go. He wouldn't have to have 10 plagues. He wouldn't have had his whole army wiped out when the sea capsized on them. But no, God hardened his heart. He kept making the stakes higher, ended up with 10 plagues, and his entire army lost at the sea, the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. God hardened the heart, unbelievable by miracle, of King Hussein. And King Hussein did not have to go into the war. He had East Jerusalem. He had Judea Samaria occupied, illegally, by the way. By the way, from 1948 to 1967, the so-called West Bank, Judea Samaria, nobody had it. Arabs, Jordan took it illegally. Nobody recognized it, not even Norway or Ireland or Spain. Nobody recognized it. Not the UN, not even the anti-Semites. No one recognized that Jordan was occupying, and they decided, let's join and let's get, maybe we'll get most of Palestine. Palestine and Israel, same thing. No such thing as Palestinian Arabs. We're Palestinians in the sense they're Israelis. If you're an Arab who lives in Israel, you're an Israeli Arab or a Palestinian Arab, and the Jews who live there are Israeli Jews or Palestinian Jews. So by God's miracle, Hussein got into the war. When you make a war, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The Arabs lost, and as a result, Israel took the land of Judea Samaria. And that's what's going on nowadays. So what we're seeing is in the Torah, in Devarim Chaf, chapter 20 of Devarim, and the Rambam we're learning, if the king wins, if they would have won, we wouldn't even be here in class today. We would have all been wiped out. Again, you're not, in those days, all the Jews lived in Israel. You didn't have Jews in the New World and living in Europe and living in Asia. All the Jews lived in Israel. And so, in the Torah times. So if we had really lost, there'd be no Jews. We wouldn't be here. In that time, in that place, if the king won, he took their land or he took some of their money. V'yam lo hishlimu, o hishlimu v'lo kiblu sheva mitzvot. And if the losing side refused to make peace, but insisted to their dying day, they will remain at war, then Rambam brings from the Talmud and from chapter 20 of Deuteronomy that we fight them until they're wiped out. And you see what goes on in Gaza. And I am not calling for genocide. And again, I began class different times, call for different circumstances. But you see what goes on. 5 times in the last 18 years, Hamas has started a war. Each time Israel fought back and won. They fought back, they got him. Hamas begged for ceasefire. And I get it. Now everyone blames Netanyahu, me also. But at the time, I get what was going through Netanyahu's mind. 5 times in 18 years, as he was responding to the attacks successfully, and Israel was wiping out Hamas. And then once Hamas was getting wiped out, they begged for a ceasefire. And so many Israelis were saying, don't give it to them, wipe them out. He kept doing ceasefires. And I understand it now. He was afraid of this. He was afraid that in order to really put an end to Hamas and put an end to this, it would lead to this. The world would turn on Israel. Everybody would accuse them of genocide. And so he wanted to show we're not out for genocide. We just want to be left alone. So we're willing, even though we could wipe you out, we're willing to sign a ceasefire. And 3 years later, the Hamas start a war again. They break the ceasefire, everything all over again. Some of you may have forgotten, some of us haven't. 5 wars like this over 18 years. There's a professor, Daniel Pipes, who actually became well known in Jewish circles, starting what he called a campaign for victory, where he started getting academics and legal scholars to sign petitions and to bring pressure among friends in the Knesset that they should start pressing Israel. The next time there's a war, don't make an end until you get full victory. Until you have victory, you'll never have peace with these people. And that's what's going on now. And Netanyahu knew what it would cost. And there's something more to be said about that, which we don't have time for. But that's what the Rambam is bringing out. That if they're going to keep making war, and they absolutely refuse to make peace, and you ask yourself, if they're getting squashed, and they're getting kiboshed, or whatever the word is, and they're kiboshed, and they're just getting massacred and by a defensive battle, why don't they give up? And you'd say, doesn't make sense, but we're watching it in our very eyes, in front of our very eyes. They just won't give up. 75% of Gaza is blown up. They've got all this stuff going on. They're like, you know what they remind me of? They remind me of that guy in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Remember that guy, and he chop off his arm. He's there. He's like the bad guy, and he's going to fight the king, Arthur. And Arthur chops off his arm, and the blood goes shooting. And he says, "That's nothing, just a scratch." Then they chop off his other arm. And goes, "That's nothing." And then they chop off his leg and his other leg, and it's like he's not stopping. And in the end, King Arthur lets him live. I think all he had left was a torso. So that's really what you're dealing with Hamas. It's nothing. 75%. We're winning. We're winning. You guys, we're almost there. And what are you going to do? So Rambam says you have to kill them out. Ein meinichi mehen mishama. You don't leave any of them behind. As the Torah says, Rak me'arei ha'armim lo techayeh kol neshama. So let's go back and let's remind ourselves. What does it say in Deuteronomy 20? If they do not surrender to you, v'im lo tashlim imach, v'ostai imcha milchama v'tzarta aleha, and then they just insist on continuing to battle with you, then you got to fight back. You can't just unilaterally cease fire. Otherwise, you end up with a 2005 evacuation of Gaza. And God will give you victory. And you'll kill all the men by sword. You should go ahead and take as your booty and as your spoils the women, the children, the livestock, etc. And that's what you should do from countries that are not of the 7 nations that you're commanded to utterly wipe out. But as far as those 7 nations, the Hittite, Yevusi, Girgashi, Amori, those 7 nations and the Amalekites, they must be completely removed from the land of Israel, and they must be completely uprooted. And the same thing is the Torah commandment in chapter 25 of Deuteronomy in Amalek, Parak Hey. When your God Hashem grants you safety from all your enemies around you, and the land that your God Hashem is giving you is a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Now, again, we don't, in a way, I guess it's been achieved because we don't know who Amalek is. There are certain nations, empires that have disappeared. For example, we know there are people living in Egypt, but that's not the Egyptian empire. That's not the Egyptian, that's geographically Egypt, but that's not the Egyptian empire of the pharaohs and the pyramids. You have the people live in Rome, Italy, but that's not the Roman Empire. In many ways, that's completely different DNA, different genes. Other peoples from other societies made war the period of all the barbaric tribes. They were. I'm not using barbaric as an adjective. They were known as the period of the barbarians, and those barbaric tribes went to war and they wiped out the Roman Empire. And so it goes. The Greek Empire, the people living in Athens, Greece now, that's not the Greek Empire. Yes, they still have ruins. Gesundheit, hey, a good tour, but that's not the empire. And so the same has happened with the Babylonian Empire. There are people living in Iraq. We don't know who the God. And the Median Empire, and the same with the Amalek. They actually are gone. Did we wipe them out? Did history wipe them out? But that's what we were commanded. Joshua chapter 11, verse 20 explains, for it was God's doing, just as he did with King Hussein, just as he did with the Pharaoh of Egypt. It was God's miracle to stiffen their hearts, to motivate them to go to battle against Israel, in order that they might be defeated and left without land and wiped out. Kima'et Hashem hoyata lechazek et libam likrat milchama et Yisrael. Lechazek et libam, to harden their hearts. The exact same expression as we find in the book of Exodus, Shmot, regarding Vayechazak Hashem et lev Paro, that God hardened the Pharaoh's heart. Leman hacharimam levilti hayot lem techina, in order to bring a cherim on them, to wipe them out completely. Leman hashmidam, to wipe them out. This is what God did. They were to be wiped out. So on the ethics of Jews going to war, and this doesn't apply directly exactly in the modern era, because there are other factors as I began class today. Context is important. Evolving times and laws and traditions are important. The inference is that even from what Joshua said, interesting, Rambam adds, the fact that Joshua says, did you pick this up? That the Jews were commanded, we know from the Bible, from the Torah, Jews were commanded to wipe out the 7 nations, including, for example, the ones I just referred to, like the Hivi, the Hivites. And then Joshua says it was from God to stiffen their hearts to make battle. so that they might be defeated and left without land and wiped out. You see what Rambam picks up from that? It's very, very keen. Even the 7 nations, although it sounds like in Deuteronomy 20, Devarim Chaf, that God was commanding that those 7 nations be wiped out mercilessly, no men, no women, no children, no nothing. Rambam is picking up from Joshua, from Joshua's own mouth, this direct quote, that even the Chivi, one of these 7 proscribed nations that were to be wiped out completely, that they couldn't actually do it until the Chivi refused to make peace and insisted on going to war until the end. That, as Joshua says, it was from God to harden their hearts, to force upon the Jews no choice but to fight them to the end. Had their hearts not been hardened, even though the Chivi, the Hivites, were one of the 7 nations that the Torah seems to say need to be wiped out completely, had God not hardened their hearts, Jewish ethics and values of war would not have allowed the Jews to kill them out. But doesn't it say in Deuteronomy 20 that they are to kill them out and leave no one? Yeah, and it also says in 3 different places in the Torah that if someone takes out an eye, you should take an eye for an eye. And if someone takes out a tooth for a tooth. And never in all of Jewish history, never in all of Jewish history has Judaism practiced an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a bruise for a bruise. Lex talionis, as it's known in Latin. The Talmud in Mesekhet Baba Kama, in the Tractate Baba Kama, talks about the idea that it cannot be, and it never was meant to be taken literally. There are many things in the Torah that, as you know from my teaching and from other rabbis' teachings, it's called the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah. The 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, Jews refer to as the written Torah. The written Torah, not to be confused with the oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh. We believe that God spent 40 days and 40 nights with Moshe Rabbeinu, atop Mount Sinai, teaching Moshe Rabbeinu the much, much greater, vaster body of Jewish law during those 40 days and 40 nights orally. Just as you're learning from me right now, orally, except for a little bit that I read from Doris Kearns Goodwin. Everything else has been orally. So Moshe learned from God for 40 days and 40 nights, 960 hours, all of Judaism orally, in a professor-student experience. What is written in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Torah, that's like an outline. That's just like those cliff notes that people used in college when they didn't want to read the whole book, so they read the short summary of the notes. The Torah is like the cliff notes of Judaism. So you cannot understand Judaism without the oral law. The Torah says that on Rosh Hashanah, it's a day to sound an instrument, but it does not say what instrument. How do we know? Every Jew knows it's the ram's horn, the shofar. How do we know it? It does not say that in the Torah. It's in the oral law. It says for Yom Kippur, this shall be a day of suffering and self-affliction. Be'initem et nafshotechem. You shall make yourself suffer. How? How? Does that mean spending the whole day watching bad movies? Does it mean having conversations with people you hate talking to? How do you afflict yourself all day? The oral law teaches explicitly. You're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur, not allowed to drink, not allowed to wash above your knuckle, not allowed to apply ointments, not allowed to wear leather shoes. You may wear other leather garments, and even if it has a leather logo on the sneaker, but not allowed to wear leather shoes with leather uppers and leather soles. And husbands and wives are not allowed to be physically intimate. And obviously, if they're not married, of course, not allowed to be physically intimate. And that's the 6 things that are forbidden on Yom Kippur. How do we know? And the Torah says that on Sukkot you should take a goodly fruit, a pre-Eitz Hadar. Everybody knows that on Sukkot, that reference is to an etrog, a citron. Citron's like a lemon. Only difference is a lemon costs, I don't know, $1, a quarter, $2, I don't know what it costs. But an etrog costs $70. Why would you spend $70 if you can get away with $1? So the reason is that you can't use a lemon, you have to use a citron, an etrog. Well, why? Because it's in the oral law. Where does it say it in the Torah? It doesn't. It simply says a goodly fruit, pre-Eitz Hadar, which also could be translated to mean a fruit that lasts on a tree a long time. And it's only in the oral law, and so on and so forth. I give you example. I go on for 3-4 hours. I'm not going to, with examples of things in the Torah that just aren't explained. We don't even know how to slaughter meat. Okay, the Torah tells us not to eat pig and not to eat rabbit, and it tells us pretty much nothing else. Very, very little. It tells us that the fish we have has to be skin and fins, and it has to be fins and scales, and can't just be like lobster and seafood like that. Has to have scales and fins and other stuff about fowl, FOWL. But the vast majority of kosher law also is oral law, how to slaughter the animal, shchita, etc., etc. So in the same way, Devarim Chav, chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, says you'll wipe them out, and then the oral law, as Rambam shows you from the words of Joshua, you still need for the other side to be offered peace, and for them absolutely explicitly to refuse to make peace. Only if they refuse to make peace, then you may wipe them out. And that's what happened with the Chivite, and that's what happened with these others. They wouldn't make peace. And therefore, you know that Israel is not aiming to eradicate, wipe out the Arabs. You know that this genocide is a bunch of garbage. It's like, historically, there have been so many slanders and libels against the Jewish people, claims that we murdered Christian babies so we could have their blood, and that we make matzah with their blood. It's such an absurd thing to charge against the people who aren't even allowed to eat blood of animals. We're forbidden to have blood. When you slaughter an animal that's permitted, and this does not apply to like a pig or a forbidden animal to begin with, but even a permitted animal like a cow, to get beef, you're still not allowed to eat it until you soak the beef and then put koshering salt on it and let the salt draw blood, any remaining blood, out of the animal. Then you wash off the salt and any blood that was still adhering. We're people that aren't allowed to even have blood from animals that we're allowed to slaughter, even when we slaughter them properly. So to go and say that Jews are slaughtering kids to have their blood to make matzah, and yet the world believed it. Jews were massacred in many countries in the Middle Ages because of that lie. And so now there's a new lie, genocide. What is genocide? The deliberate murdering of a people. If Israel wanted to wipe out all the people in Gaza, those guys would have been done 15 years ago. If you want to just get a flavor of it, by accident, 34 people died in a bombing that didn't even aim at them. Imagine if Israel were dropping bombs, aiming at them. They would all be wiped out. If Israel wanted to wipe them out, would they be sending all this humanitarian aid and food? I mean, we've gone through it in the Sunday class, how many tons upon thousands of tons of food they've let in, and so on and so forth. It's just absurd. So it's important to understand that the Jewish ethic of war is not to hurt people once they leave you alone. And we're learning it from here as well. So as Joshua says, Lo hayata, on the one hand, Lo hayata ir asher hishlima ben Yisrael bilti hachivi yoshvei givon, et hakol lakhu b'mochama, no nation among the biblical nations was willing to make peace against the Chivite, and then the Chivi also decided, we're also going to make war. God hardened their hearts. Shlosha ketavim shalach Yoshua ad shelo nichnas liYisrael. So as Joshua came in to make battle, this is the last section we're going to do for tonight. As Joshua went to make battle, and as we said, the very first ethic and value is you have to allow the other side, you have to allow them peace. You have to allow them to make peace. And by the way, you also have to allow them an escape route. You cannot hold them in and surround them like a siege that allows them nowhere to escape. Imagine that. Imagine that. You have to allow an escape route. So Joshua sent 3 messages to those nations prior to entering the land of Israel when they crossed over the Jordan at the end of the 40 years wandering in the desert to take possession of the inheritance that God promised Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land of Israel. Harishon shalach lahem, mishra rotzeh livrach yivrach. His first message was, anyone among you who wishes to flee is free to go. Go ahead and go. We'll wait for all of you to leave, or as many as want to leave, and we will not pursue you. We have no desire to hurt you. V'chazar v'shalach misha rotzeh lahashlim yashlim. Then, after waiting a sufficient time for those who would flee to flee, he sent the second message. Okay, the rest of you who have not fled, anyone who wants lahashlim, to make shalom, to make peace, yashlim. Let us know you want to make peace. And we are prepared to make peace with any of you that wants to make peace. Okay. And that left a population of people who had not fled and did not make peace. V'chazar v'shalach, and then he sent a third of his 3 messages. Misha rotzeh la'asot milchama yaseh. Okay, whoever's still here that wants to make war, let's have it. Go at it. Im kain mipnei ma ha'arimu yoshvei givon lefi sheshalach lahem baklav v'lo kiblu v'lo yada'u mishpat Yisrael v'dimu sheshuv ein potchin lahem l'shalom. I cannot take out the time now, as we're about to end our class, perhaps another class, to talk about the people of Givon, the so-called Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were offered peace, as we just learned, and they actually wanted peace. But when they were offered peace, they did not ask for peace. So Rambam says, given that we see from what unfolded that they wanted peace, given that Joshua offered them peace, why didn't they accept the peace? And he says, because they didn't believe him. V'lo yada'u mishpat Yisrael. They didn't know that Jews basically are different from other people. What do other people do? Other nations in history, they offer peace. Look what happened to poor Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, we got a lot of issues with Ukraine. If you study the 1930s and 1940s and the Einsatzgruppen, plenty of issues with Ukraine. But poor Ukraine. So what happened when the Soviet Union got disemboweled and the whole empire came to an end, and Georgia went Georgia, and each place went its own way, and Ukraine broke off, and they all broke off. Ukraine had the nuclear weapons. It happens to be where they were part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviets had based a lot of their nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And when the Soviets came to an end, and Boris Yeltsin on that tank, Soviet Union, and the East Berlin Wall came down, and Pax Bush, now PAX, Pax Bush, that there's going to be world peace under George Bush. If you remember, the Ukrainians said, okay, they sang Hivenu Shalom Aleichem, and they basically gave up the whole nuclear arsenal, gave it back to the, what do we need it for? And then Putin, and now they don't have them. So people have learned, for example, you can't make peace with Putin. If Putin says, come and make peace, any Shlemiel that makes peace with Putin ends up graduating from Shlemiel to Shlomazel. Like that head of the Wagner group. Remember him? So he's leading a rebellion against Putin. Then he realizes it's fizzing out. And Putin says to him, come on, make peace, finish Gnuk. We'll make peace. Let bygones be bygones. So the guy says, okay, we're finished. You could be Putin. I'm not trying to kill you anymore. I'll just use my Wagner group in Africa to make revolutions. And then one day he goes in a plane and Putin shoots him down. And basically, any moron, everybody by now figures out, if Putin says, make peace with me, you don't make peace with Putin. You don't start up with him to begin with. I personally have never started in with Putin. And for the record, Putin, I have nothing against you. The thing is, you don't start up with Putin. Who do you start up with? You start up with people that you know you can beat. So the Gibeonites were afraid that the Israelis under Joshua were like Putin. We'll go ahead, we'll drop our weapons, we'll give up, we'll walk, and they'll slaughter us. That's the reason that even though the Gibeonites wanted peace, they did not make peace. And we'll learn more about what that's all about, because in the end, an interesting story unfolds with that. But for that, we need another class. So that's the thrust of tonight. The main takeaways are, number one, every time and period has to be judged in its context, but broad values transcend time and context. Number two, as a broad Jewish ethic and value of war, we never harm innocent civilians. We always allow, Jews are commanded always to allow civilians who want to make peace. You must allow them to make peace, even from the 7 nations that we were commanded to wipe out. And those who want to flee, we must always allow them an exit route. And those who don't want to flee and don't want to make peace, then you say to them, if you want war, we'll wipe you out. And for that, we have no apologies. No apologies for what happens once we wipe them out, because we did everything practical. And anyone who's fair knows that once a war goes, a war is not like something you play on a computer or in a box game, a tabletop game, like Risk, where I get your little cubes and you get my little cubes, and I'm going to trade in 3 cards. I've got a soldier and I've got a tank, and that's not how war goes. If the enemy is hiding among civilians in residential buildings, building murder tunnels underneath homes and underneath mosques and underneath libraries and public schools and UN facilities and hospitals, it is what it is. They've been invited to leave, and they've been given a chance to make peace. And even while negotiating, make peace, give back the hostages, they won't do it. And so that's our takeaway. Final word. Last week we talked about Shechem, Nablus, and I told you something about how Nablus got to be called Nablus. And if I find it quickly, okay, let me try this really quick. I had a discussion with Asaf Gozlan. This is Asaf week, because I mentioned him yesterday also. Asaf was talking to me about the, let me try it on this one. See if I can make it bigger and bigger. First, let me take this off the screen. And once I do that, I then can make it bigger by making it bigger by doing this. Okay. Come on. Okay, just give me one more moment. Okay, there we go. So it's easier for you to follow. The city that's in the Torah known as Shechem, but it's called by the Arabs Nablus. Nablus was founded by Vespasian in 72 of the Common Era. That's 2 years after he destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. And he named it initially Flavia Neapolis, a new metropolis, a new metropolis, a new city, Neapolis, Flavia, named for Flavia. Okay. And so Neapolis was hostile to Septimius Severus, who therefore temporarily deprived it of municipal status. Philip the Arab turned it to a Roman colony called Julia Neapolis, And remember again that Arabs there cannot pronounce the letter P. They pronounce it like a B, like you bring back the pizza. The city was conquered in 636 by the Arabs who retained its name in the form of Nablus. So it went from Neapolis to Julianapolis to Nablus because they couldn't pronounce the P. And then from 1099 to 1187, the city was held by the Christians who took it from the Muslims, and the Crusaders renamed it Naples, which gets into what I was talking about last time. And then after Naples, it became once again Nablus. And so that's how Shechem became Nablus. But for all intents and purposes, it is Shechem, a biblical city referred to many times in the Torah, and that's where Joseph is buried, and many other things that we don't have time for now. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And you learned about Abraham Lincoln also. I hope, I mean, whether you're disillusioned, you think about it. Have a wonderful, wonderful night. And we see you, Shabbat Shalom, and God willing, we'll see you on Sunday. Bye-bye.